Chapter 33. She waited until an hour after the background sounds of the household had quieted down. Then, getting up from her bed, Shada left her room in the vast underground complex that was George Cardas's home and slipped down the darkened hallway. The library door was closed, and the Ang T hand-waving trick Cardass had used to get inside obviously wasn't going to work for her. However, before saying goodnight, he had showed her and Card the more conventional method of opening their room doors, and she was banking on the library being set up the same way. Searching around the stones lining the doorway with her fingers, she found the slightly cooler one and pressed her palm against it. For perhaps 20 seconds, nothing happened. Shada maintained her pressure on the stone, alert for signs of activity in the area and wondering again at this ridiculous procedure. Based on the life story he'd told them, she couldn't see the George Cardass who had first arrived here on Exocron being an overly patient man. Certainly not the type to install doors in his home that took half a minute to open. She could only assume his thinking at that time had been that intruders bent on theft or violence would be similarly impatient. Now, of course, with his Ang T tricks, none of it mattered. At least not to him. Beneath her hand, the trigger stone gave a gentle bump. Shada held on, and a few seconds later the door finally slid ponderously open. She'd expected the library to be as dark as the rest of the house, with only a handful of muted glow panels to show the way around. To her uneasy surprise, the room was lit much more brightly than that. Not as bright as it had been when Cardass showed it to them earlier, but brighter than an uninhabited room ought to be. She slipped inside, ducking to the left out of the doorway, and as she did so, she caught a glimpse of a moving shadow in the central circle near the computer desk. Cardass? She bit back a curse. Card had already scheduled an early morning departure for the Wildcard's rendezvous with the Yang T ship. This was her one and only chance to get to the data cards she needed to find. And then, drifting up from the computer desk, she heard a muffled but very familiar voice. Distinctive, somewhat prissy, and quite mechanical. Silently, she detached herself from the wall and made her way down one of the narrow aisles between the data cases and headed to the center. To find that her ears had indeed not been playing tricks on her. Hello, Mistress Shada, 3PO said brightly, straightening up from his stooping lean over the computer desk. I thought you and the others had retired for the night. I thought you had done so too, Shada said, glancing at the nearest data case as she stepped over to him. Each shelf completely packed with stacks of data cards, each stack of data cards standing 8 to 10 deep. An incredible collection of knowledge. Or whatever it is droids do at night. Oh, I usually close down for a time, 3PO told her. But during my talk earlier with Master Cardass, he suggested I might wish to have a chat with the main computer. Not that the computer aboard the Wildcard isn't decent company, of course, he added hastily. But I must admit I sometimes miss R2 and others of my own kind. I understand, Shada assured him, a lump forming in her throat. It can be very lonely to be somewhere where you're out of place. Really, 3PO said interestedly. I suppose I'd always assumed human beings were adaptable to most every place and circumstance. Being adaptable to something doesn't necessarily mean you like it, Shada pointed out. In many ways, I'm as much out of place aboard the Wildcard as you are. The droid tilted his head. I'm so sorry, Mistress Shada, he said, sounding pained. I had no idea you felt that way. Is there anything I can do to help? Maybe help me return to where I belong. Shada gestured down at the computer desk. Have you gotten to know the computer well enough to be able to do a search of Cardass's library? Certainly, 3PO said, his voice suddenly wary. But this is Master Cardass's equipment. I'm not sure I should. It'll be all right, Shada soothed him. I'm not going to steal anything. All I want is one small piece of information. I suppose that would be all right, 3PO said, still sounding uncertain. We are his guests, after all, and guests often have the tacit run of the household. He stopped as Shada held up a hand. Can you do the search? She asked again. Yes, Mistress Shada, he replied in a somewhat subdued voice. What is it you wish to search for? Shada took a deep breath. Emberline, a quiet voice came from behind her. The planet Emberline. Oh my! 3PO gasped. Shada spun around, dropping into a slight crouch, her hand diving beneath her tunic to the grip of her blaster. Forgive me, Cardass said, coming into view around the inner circle of data cases. I didn't mean to startle you that way. I certainly hope not, Shada said, her grip still on her blaster, muscles and reflexes preparing for combat. If Cardass took exception to her being here, I didn't hear you come in. I didn't mean for you to hear me, he said, smiling. You're not planning to use that blaster, are you? So much for Mistral's subtlety. No, of course not, she said, withdrawing her hand empty. I was just. She broke off, frowning, as the words he had spoken a moment earlier suddenly penetrated her conscious mind. What did you say when you came in? I told 3PO you wanted to do a search for the planet Emberline, Cardass said, eyeing her steadily. That is what you were going to look up, wasn't it, my young Mistral Shadow Guard? Her first impulse was to deny it, but looking into that even gaze, she knew it would be a waste of effort. How long have you known? She asked instead. Oh, not long at all, he said, waving a hand in an oddly self-deprecating gesture. I suspected, of course, but I didn't actually know until you defeated those four swoopers outside Bombassa's place. Shada grimaced. So Card was right, she said. He thought giving Bombassa his name would eventually get it back to you. Cardass shook his head. You misunderstand. Bombassa doesn't work for me, nor I for him. In fact, aside from Entuni and the other few in my household, no one actually works for me at all. Right. You're retired, Shada growled. I forgot. Or else you don't truly believe, Cardass countered. Tell me, what is it you want for Emberline? What everyone else wants, she shot back. At least what they want for big important worlds like Kamas. I want justice for my people. Cardass shook his head. Your people don't want justice, Shada, he said, an infinite sadness in his voice. They never did. What are you talking about? Shada demanded, feeling her face warming. How dare you judge us? How dare you judge anyone? Sitting out here all high and mighty, never deigning to get your own hands dirty, while everyone else fights and bleeds and dies. She broke off, her rising fury at his attitude battling against her deeply ingrained fear of losing control. You don't know what it's like on Emberline, she bit out. You've never seen the suffering and squalor. You have no business saying we've given up. Cardass's eyebrows lifted. I never said you'd given up, he corrected her gently. What I said was that you didn't want justice. Then what do we want? Shada snarled. Charity? Pity? No, Cardass shook his head. Vengeance. Shada felt her eyes narrow. What are you talking about? Do you know why Emberline died, Shada? Cardass asked. Not how it died. Not the firestorming and massive air and space attack that finally crushed it. But why? She stared at him, a dark uneasiness beginning to swirl into the flame of her anger and frustration. There was something behind his eyes that she didn't like the look of at all. Someone feared our growing power and prestige and decided to make an example of us, she said carefully. Some think that person was Palpatine himself, which is why we've never worked for his empire. The eyebrows lifted again. Never? Shada had to look away from that gaze. We had millions of refugees to feed and clothe, she said, her voice sounding hollowly defensive in her ears. Yes, sometimes we worked even for the Empire. For a moment the room was filled with an awkward silence. Principles are so often like that, aren't they? Cardass said at last. So very slippery, so hard to hold on to. Shada looked back at him again, trying to come up with a properly scathing retort, but nothing came to mind. In Emberline's case, in the Mistral's case, his quiet cynicism was all too true. At any rate, that particular principle was of no real value, Cardos continued. As it happens, Palpatine had nothing to do with Emberline's destruction. He stepped past her and around to the data case behind 3PO. I have the true history of your world right here, he said, waving at the top row of data cards. I pulled all the information together once I knew you'd be coming here with Card. Would you like to see it? Automatically, Shada stepped towards him. Hesitated. What do you mean by true? She asked. What does anyone mean by true? We both know history is written by the winners. History is also written by the bystanders, Cardass said, his hands still up beside the data cards. By the Kamasi and the Alderanians and the Jedi. People who had no part or stake in what happened. Would you accuse all of them of lying? Shada swallowed, fear and a horrible sense of inevitability twisting itself around her throat. And what do all of these disinterested parties say? She asked. Slowly, Cardass lowered his hand. They say that 3 years before its destruction, he said gently, the rulers of Emberline set off on a rampage of conquest. That for the first 2.5 of those years, they destroyed and conquered and plundered every one of the dozen other worlds within their reach. No, Shada heard herself whisper. No, that can't be true. We wouldn't. We couldn't have done something like that. The average citizens weren't told the true story, of course, Cardass said. Though I imagine most could have read between the lines if they truly wanted to know what their leaders were doing. But they had triumph and spoils, pride and glory. Why bother with mere truth? Again, Shada had to look away from those eyes. It wasn't my fault, she wanted to protest. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. But the words were hollow, and she knew it. No, she hadn't been one of those who had toasted Emberline's conquests and looked eagerly ahead for more. But in dedicating her life to the Mistral, she had in her own way helped to perpetuate the lie. All because she had wanted to make a difference. You shouldn't take any of this personally, Shada, Cardass offered softly into her thoughts. You didn't know, and the desire to make a difference is something held deeply within all of us. Shada looked sharply at him. Stay out of my mind, she snapped. My thoughts are none of your business. He bowed his head briefly. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to intrude, but when someone is shouting, it's usually difficult not to overhear. Well, try harder. Shada took a deep breath. So what happened? How were we finally stopped? Your victims and potential victims were too weak to fight back on their own, Cardass said. So they pooled their resources and hired a mercenary army. The army was perhaps overly thorough. Overly thorough. Again, Shada searched for a blistering retort. Again, there was nothing she could say. And all in the sector rejoiced, she murmured. Yes, Cardass said quietly, but for the stopping of a dangerous war machine, not for the suffering of the innocent. No, the innocent are never a very high priority, are they? Shada said, hearing the bitterness in her voice. Does your true history tell who the army was who destroyed us, or who their sponsors were? His face seemed to settle subtly. Why do you want to know? Shada shrugged, an uncomfortable hunching of suddenly tired shoulders. My people have never known who did it. And if I give you that information, what will you do with it? Cardass asked. Turn the vengeance of the Mistral against them after all these years? Create more suffering among still more innocents? The words were a sudden stab in her heart. I don't know what they'll do with it, Shada said, a sudden misting in her eyes blurring her sight. All I know is that it's the only thing I can take back that might let... She broke off, swiping viciously at her eyes. You don't want to go back to them, Shada, Cardass said. They're living a lie, whether they know it or not. That's not for you. I have to, Shada said miserably. Don't you understand? I have to work for something larger than myself. I've always needed that. I have to have something to hold on to and to serve that I can believe in. What about the new republic? Cardass asked. Or Card himself? The new republic doesn't want me, she bit out. And Card, she shook her head, an acid burning in her throat. Card's a smuggler, Cardass, just like you were. What kind of purpose is that to believe in? Oh, I don't know, Cardass said thoughtfully. Card has altered the organization considerably since my days with it. It's still the fringe, Shada said. It's still illegal and underhanded. I want something honorable, something noble. Is that so much to ask for? No, of course not, Cardass said. Still, Card's much more an information broker now than he is a smuggler. Isn't that at least a little better? No, Shada said. In fact, it's worse. Information brokering is nothing more than selling people's private property to those who don't deserve to have it. Interesting point of view, Cardass murmured, his gaze shifting to Shada's right. Have you ever considered it that way? I haven't up till now, Card's voice said. Shada spun around, shaking the last lingering tears from her eyes. Off to her right, dressed in a robe and ship slippers, Card was standing just outside the inner circle, regarding her with an odd expression on his face. Perhaps I need to reassess my thinking, he added. What are you doing here? Shada demanded. Cardass called me, Card said. He looked at Cardass, his forehead wrinkling. At least, I think he called me. Oh, yes, definitely, Cardass assured him. I thought you should be in on this part of the conversation. He bowed his head to Shada. Forgive me again, Shada, if I startled you. Shada fought back a grimace. He's just full of surprises, isn't he? She commented. He's always been that way, Card agreed, stepping over to her side. All right, Cardass. Your two puppets are assembled and awaiting your commands. What do you want from us? Cardass's eyes widened in a look of innocence. Me? He protested. I want nothing from you, my friends. On the contrary, I wish to present you with a gift. Shada glanced at Card, found him throwing her the same suspicious look. Really, Card said dryly. And what kind of gift might that be? Cardass smiled. You were never one to appreciate surprises, were you, Card? He said. Not too bad at dealing them out, mind you, but extremely poor at accepting them. But I think you'll like this one. He turned to the data case behind him and selected two data cards from the top shelf. This is the gift I offer, he said, turning back to face them, holding one of the data cards in each hand. This, he held up his right hand, is the history of Emberline I was just speaking to Shada about. Something she very much wants, or at least has thought in the past that she wanted. This, he held up his left hand, is a data card I made up especially for you. One which I personally think will be far more beneficial for everyone in the long run. What's on it? Card asked. Useful information. Cardass laid them down side by side on the computer desk. You may have one of them. Please choose. Beside her, Shada felt Card take a deep breath. It's your choice, Shada, he said quietly. Take whichever one you wish. Shada stared down at the two data cards, waiting for the inevitable emotional turmoil to twist through her. Her only hope of rejoining the Mistral, perhaps her only hope of even staying alive through the death mark they'd put on her, lay there to their left. To her right was an unknown quantity, put together by an old man who might easily be half insane, for the supposed benefit of another man whose whole purpose in life was the antithesis of what she herself had always yearned for. But to her wary surprise, the turmoil never came. Had Cardass's earlier revelations merely burned all of it out of her, she wondered vaguely, leaving no strength left to drive such emotions as anger or uncertainty? But no. There was no turmoil because there was no real decision to be made. Cardass was right. She could no longer work with the Mistral, who served and killed and died so that Emberline could someday rise again. Not now that she knew what Emberline had once been. And certainly not now that she could see what the 11 might do with the knowledge on that data card. The justice she had once thought she was seeking had already been carried out. All that data card could create was vengeance. Reaching across the desk, distantly aware that she was now finally crossing the final bridge from her past, she picked up the data card on the right. "I'm pleased with you, Shada Dukal, child of the Mistral," Cardass said with a warmth she had never heard in his voice before. "I promise you won't be disappointed." Shada looked at Card, steeling herself for his reaction to Cardass's revelation, but he merely smiled. "It's all right," he said. "I've known who you are for a long time." She looked back at Cardass. "Who I was," she corrected Card quietly. "What I am now? I don't know." "You'll find your way," Cardass assured her. Abruptly, he straightened and rubbed his hands together. "But now, it's time to go." Shada blinked. "Already? I thought we had until morning." "Why, it is morning out there," Cardass said, coming around the computer desk and taking Card and Shada each by an arm. "Close enough, at least. Come, come. There's a great deal yet for you to do. You too, 3PO. Come along." "What about this?" Shada asked, waving the data card as Cardass hustled them up the aisle towards the exit. "You can read it on the way to the rendezvous point," Cardass told her. "Just the two of you together. No one else. After that, I think you'll know what to do." They reached the door and Cardass waved it open. "What about you?" Card asked as the old man steered them back down the hallway, now properly lit again, towards their rooms. "My door's always open to you," Cardass said. "Either of you, of course. Come back any time you want to visit. But for now, you must hurry." An hour later, the wild card lifted from Exocron and headed out into space. An hour after that, after assuring himself that they were properly on their way to the rendezvous with the waiting Ang-T ship, Card took Shada back to his office. And sitting together in front of his desk display, they read the data card. Shada was the first to break the silence. "He was right, wasn't he?" she murmured. "This is incredible. If it's true, that is." "Oh, it's true," Card said, gazing at the display, his mind spinning furiously. Shada had vastly understated the case. Incredible didn't even begin to cover it. If he was nothing else in his entire life, Cardass was always reliable. "I can believe that." Shada shook her head. "I take it we're going to have the Ang-T take us straight back to Coruscant with this?" Card hesitated. Coruscant was, of course, the obvious choice, but there was a complete range of possibilities here. Some very interesting possibilities indeed. "Card?" Shada cut into his thoughts, her tone suddenly suspicious. "We are taking this back to Coruscant, aren't we?" He smiled at her. "Actually, no," he said. "I think we can do better than that." He looked back at the display, feeling his smile turn grim. "Much, much better." Standing astride the command walkway of the Imperial Star Destroyer Tyrannic, Captain Nalgel stared out into the blackness beyond the viewports. There was still nothing to see out there, of course, unless one of their probe ships happened to dip into the edge of the cloaking shield, or he wanted to contemplate the dirty edge of the comet at their side. But it was tradition for a ship's captain to gaze at the universe from his bridge, and Nalgel was feeling rather traditional today. 4 days. 4 more days, and the long, stultifying idleness would finally be over. Just 4 days, assuming the strike team was still on schedule. 4 days. From the far end of the command walkway, he could hear Intelligence Chief Oyson's slightly clunky footsteps approaching. Nearly 10 minutes late, he noted with disapproval as he glanced at his chrono. Captain, Oysen said, puffing slightly as he came up beside Naugol, I have the latest probe ship report for you. Naugol turned to him, noting the slight redness of Oysen's face. You're late, he said. There was more analysis required than usual, Oysen said stiffly, holding out a datapad. It seems the ships over Bothawui nearly started the war a few days early. Naugol felt his eyes narrow as he took the datapad. What are you talking about? He demanded, keying for the proper file. One of the Ashuri warships decided to push at the Diamala, Oysen said. He came within half a blink of pushing them into open combat. Naugol swore under his breath, glancing over the report. If those hot-headed alien fools started their hostilities before the strike team was ready. What stopped them? He asked. Never mind. There it is, he added, skimming the section. Interesting. Did anyone get an ID on that freighter? None of the probe ships were close enough for a positive ID, Oysen said. But the follow-up comm traffic through the fleet said it was High Counselor Organa Solo. That's unconfirmed, though. But highly likely, Naugol grunted. Here to help Gaversom calm everyone down, no doubt. No doubt. Oysen lifted his eyebrows. The rumors also say she brought a Kamasi Trustant with her. Do they now? Naugol said, feeling a slow smile starting to tug at the corners of his mouth. Do they really? We should know for sure in a day or two, Oysen pointed out. If Gaversom has a real Kamasi there with his peace envoy, he's sure to parade him out in front of everybody as soon as he can. Indeed, Naugol murmured. And if he can keep him here talking peace for 4 more days, we'll be able to say there was a Kamasi present at the destruction of Bothawui. Present, and by implication, fully approving. He shook his head wonderingly. Amazing. I wonder how Thrawn pulled that one off. It's amazing, all right, Oysen agreed, not sounding nearly so enthusiastic. I just hope he hasn't miscalculated somewhere along the line. 191 warships would be a little much for 3 Star Destroyers to take on all by ourselves. You worry too much, Naugol chided, handing back the datapad. I've seen Thrawn at work, and he never miscalculates anything. The strike team will do their job, and then those warships of yours will commence tearing each other apart. All we'll have to do is eliminate the survivors and demolish whatever's left of the planet. Or so goes the theory, anyway, Oysen said sourly. May I recommend, Captain, that you at least put the Tyrannic and the others on standby alert for the remainder of our time out here? That way we'll be able to move quickly if things break sooner than expected. It'll also mean 4 extra days' worth of worn-off combat edges, Naugol reminded him. I hardly think that would be useful. But if things break too soon... They won't, Naugol cut him off brusquely. If Thrawn says 4 days, it'll be 4 days. Period. Oysen took a deep breath. Yes, sir, he muttered. Naugol eyed the other, a mixture of contempt and pity flickering through him. Oysen, after all, had never met Thrawn, had never heard the confidence and authority in the Grand Admiral's voice. How could he possibly understand? All right, we'll compromise, he said. I'll order preliminary battle prep to begin this afternoon, and 1 day before the projected flashpoint, we'll go to standby alert. Will that make you feel better? Yes, sir, Oysen's mouth twitched. Thank you, sir. And your preliminary battle prep will begin right now, Naugol continued, gesturing at the datapad. I want you to make up a priority threat list for every one of these ships out there. Put in everything you have about their capabilities, defenses, and weaknesses, and include details of captain and crew species where possible. He smiled tightly. When we finally come from under this cursed cloaking shield, I want to be able to slice straight through whatever's left without losing so much as a single turbolaser or prey bird. Understood? Understood, Captain, Oysen said. I'll have it ready for you by tomorrow. Very good, Naugol nodded. Dismissed. Turning smartly, Oysen headed aft at a quick walk along the command walkway. Nalgo watched him for a moment, then turned back to the empty view through the viewport. 4 days. 4 days, and they would finally have their chance to slaughter rebel scum. He smiled into the darkness. Yes, he was indeed feeling very traditional today. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.